It was the kind of morning that should have passed without incident. A quiet, crisp December day in a polished Alabama suburb where the lawns were always trimmed, the air was always calm, and danger felt like a foreign concept. The home of Judge Robert Vance stood proud in Mountain Brook, a symbol of prestige and discipline. He was a man who commanded respect without demanding it, respected by his peers, revered by many in the legal world, and feared by those who saw him as an immovable wall of justice. But even walls can crumble, even homes that feel untouchable can be breached. And sometimes death arrives in the most ordinary disguise, a cardboard box with holiday postage. It happened in the kitchen. The box was addressed with care, wrapped to blend in with the season's deliveries. A return address that looked familiar, stamped as if sent by a fellow judge. But inside, a different message, a pipe bomb packed with smokeless powder, laced with hate, sealed with precision. As Judge Vance opened the package, a violent explosion tore through his home. Shrapnel and nails tore into his chest. The force lifted him off the floor. His wife Helen was just steps away, severely wounded by the same blast that killed her husband in seconds. The kitchen became a war zone. The floor slick with blood, the air thick with smoke, and the echo of the explosion ringing through a neighborhood that would never forget that sound. Robert Vance was 58 years old, a judge on the United States Court of Appeals for the 11th Circuit, known for his calm temperament and sharp intellect. His rulings had shaped the law in the South. He had dealt with civil rights cases, voting rights cases, and controversial appeals. But never had he imagined that his judgment from the bench would come back to him in a box marked with stamps. The news shook the legal world. This wasn't just a murder, it was a declaration. An attack on a federal judge was an attack on the very foundation of justice. And the message was clear. No one was safe, not even in Mountain Brook, not even in their own kitchen. But that was just the beginning. 2 days later, across state lines in Savannah, Georgia, another explosion. A civil rights attorney, Robert Robinson, opened a similar package in his office. It blew apart his desk, shattered the room, killed him instantly. He had been a quiet warrior in the fight for equality, a man who had helped desegregate beaches and defended the voiceless. And now he was gone, cut down not by argument or debate, but by steel and fire. The bombs were nearly identical. Pipe bombs with welded end caps, filled with red dot smokeless powder, lined with nails to maximize carnage, and the stamps, always the same. The envelopes that came with them carried cryptic messages from a group calling itself Americans for a Competent Federal Judicial System, a name that sounded like bureaucracy, but was dripping with venom. They claimed the attacks were acts of political protest, that the judiciary had failed, that someone needed to correct the balance. But behind the facade of ideology, there was only rage, raw, personal, and homicidal. Panic began to spread. Judges across the South were warned. Civil rights offices added extra precautions. And then 2 more packages were discovered, one at the 11th Circuit's headquarters in Atlanta, the other at the Jacksonville NAACP. This time, they were intercepted, disarmed before they could kill. But the message was louder than ever. Someone out there was hunting by mail. The FBI's response was immediate and enormous. Operation VANPAC, short for Vance Package, was launched. Hundreds of agents were deployed. Bomb fragments were rushed to the FBI lab, postal routes were analyzed, witnesses, vendors, and possible suspects were interrogated from Alabama to Minnesota. The fear that another bomb could arrive at any doorstep kept America's legal system on edge. People were afraid to open mail. Judges kept their distance from their own clerks. Lawyers hesitated to pick up packages off their desks. And somewhere out there, the man who set this plan in motion was still watching it unfold. And he wasn't a stranger to violence. 17 years earlier in 1972, a different bomb exploded in the home of Hazel Moody. It was her husband's bomb. He had made it allegedly for someone else, and it went off before it reached its target. Hazel survived, but barely. The case led to his conviction, but only on a technicality. He served 3 years, then walked free. The man's name, Walter Leroy Moody Jr., and he hadn't forgotten what happened. Moody was brilliant, but twisted. A self-taught inventor with an interest in electronics and an obsession with revenge. He had long believed that the federal courts had conspired to destroy him, especially after his appeals failed. And he never stopped writing. Letters to the editor, legal complaints, and eventually manifestos addressed to institutions he believed had wronged him. As the FBI pieced together fragments from the 1989 bombs, a pattern began to emerge. The construction was oddly familiar. The welds, the types of screws, the wiring patterns. ATF bomb technician Lloyd Irwin recognized the style from Moody's old 1972 bomb. A link was forming between the past and present. And when agents looked closer, the trail became undeniable. They found a typewriter with a misaligned A, the same flaw that showed up in the manifestos. They found red dot powder purchased under Moody's name. His wife, Susan McBride, cracked under questioning and admitted to mailing the packages at his instruction. And most damning of all, a chilling jailhouse recording, Moody speaking to himself in a moment of unfiltered arrogance, suggesting he'd pulled off the perfect crime. Moody hadn't just targeted Judge Vance, he targeted the entire judicial system. He tried to mask his revenge as a political act, disguising his hatred under a false flag of ideology. He believed he could confuse the investigation by planting red herrings, sending one bomb to the NAACP, another to a black civil rights lawyer, to make it look like racism. But the FBI saw through the smoke. This wasn't a campaign, it was a vendetta. And it had been decades in the making. By the time he was arrested, Moody had rewritten his life story into one of persecution and retaliation. He claimed innocence, claimed conspiracy, claimed he was a political prisoner. But the evidence was suffocating. It didn't need his confession. It already had the story. The bombs told it. The nails told it. The blood told it. What remained was the trial. And the question the nation asked, would a man who mailed death across state lines, who silenced 2 men with steel and fire, who terrorized the judiciary for sport, would he ever face the full weight of justice? That answer would come, but not quickly. This was only the first half of the war. The courtroom was silent, but the weight in the air was palpable. Walter Leroy Moody Jr. sat at the defense table in Minnesota federal court, not far from where his bombs had been tracked, his letters decoded, his voice recorded, and his wife flipped against him. It was 1991, 2 years after the bombings, and the United States government had prepared a case that read more like a manifesto of madness than a trial brief. 71 federal charges, every one of them crafted to unravel Moody's years of rage. The courtroom became a theater of justice. The audience? A country watching to see if the man who had mailed murder would finally face consequence. And leading the prosecution, a name that would later define American law enforcement, Louis Freeh. Focused, calculated, relentless. He didn't need theatrics. The evidence spoke. The forensic links between the bombs, the CCI primers, the red dot smokeless powder, the misaligned typewriter letters in the manifesto, the jailhouse recordings where Moody, like a man narrating his own downfall, talked to himself in strange, gleeful whispers. And the voice that stunned everyone, Susan McBride, Moody's own wife, who looked across the courtroom and testified that she had mailed the bombs under his command. She was his undoing. Her testimony shattered any illusion of innocence. She wasn't a scapegoat. She was a witness to the madness. She described his rants, his obsession with the judiciary, the way he rehearsed his words before writing the bomb letters. She recalled the moment he told her that one day they'd read about him in the papers, not because he made a difference, but because he sent a message. And the message had been sent, loud and deadly. On June 28, 1991, Moody was convicted. 7 life sentences, 400 years on top, no possibility of parole. But the story didn't end in federal court. Alabama had its own reckoning to deliver. Robert Vance was one of theirs. A son of Birmingham, a warrior for justice, a symbol of civil rights progress in the South. And the state would not rest until Moody answered for Vance's murder on Alabama soil. In 1996, a second trial began, this time in Birmingham, this time in the heart of the place he'd attacked. Moody tried to represent himself, delusional, unshaken. He fired lawyers, argued with the judge, called himself a patriot. It was a circus of self-destruction. The evidence was recycled, the voice recordings played again, but now it wasn't just about guilt, it was about the price. Would Alabama demand the ultimate penalty? 11 jurors said yes. 1 hesitated, but the judge ruled for death. In 1997, Moody was sentenced to die, and then the clock began to tick and tick and tick. For 21 years, appeals delayed the inevitable. Legal technicalities, habeas petitions, motions to reconsider, all filed by a man who once mailed death in a matter of days, now clinging to life with every last procedural breath. But time, like justice, has a patience of its own. And then came April 19, 2018, the end. Holman Correctional Facility. At 83 years old, Moody was wheeled into Alabama's execution chamber, the oldest inmate put to death in modern U.S. history. He refused to speak. No last words, no remorse, just silence. Lethal injection flowed through his veins, and with it, the final chapter of a man who had spent his life blaming the world for his failures, then punishing it with bombs. Outside the prison, there was no celebration, only reflection. Judge Robert Vance's son, now a judge himself, stood with quiet dignity. He didn't need vengeance, he needed closure, and it had finally come. But not everyone found peace. The scars of 1989 ran deep. Robert Robinson's family had lived through a silence much colder than justice, a civil rights hero lost, a movement shaken. The bombs hadn't just taken lives, they had sent a message that even in an age of supposed progress, hate still found a way to sneak through the cracks, packaged in cardboard and sealed with cruelty. The federal building in Birmingham now bears Judge Vance's name, a tribute, a warning, a symbol. Lawyers walk past it every day, briefcases in hand, arguments on their lips. But above them, carved in stone, is the reminder of what it means to serve justice in a world where justice is never guaranteed. The FBI preserved the case as a blueprint. VANPAC became a template for multi-agency cooperation. FBI, ATF, Postal Service, IRS, all united by one mission: catching a man who had mastered deception and confusion. New agents study the files. They analyze the patterns. They listen to Moody's tapes in training rooms and learn what happens when obsession crosses into violence. And as technology moved forward, so did the story. In 2025, modern forensic teams reviewed the case using artificial intelligence. Old powder samples reanalyzed, the metallurgy of the pipe bombs mapped in 3D simulations. The typewriter key flaws scanned into databases for automated comparison. Nothing new emerged to alter the facts. But the process reinforced a truth that had echoed since the moment Judge Vance fell to the floor of his kitchen. Science could solve what rage tried to hide. Moody never confessed, never begged, never cried. He left no apology, only suspicion. He sent a letter to Judge Vance's son, claiming innocence and blaming the government. He spun one last conspiracy theory, hoping someone would believe that he had been framed. But no one listened. The evidence had already shouted the truth. The media eventually moved on. Other stories captured the public's imagination, but in true crime circles, the Vance case endures. Because it wasn't random, it wasn't senseless. It was a chess game of terror. Moves plotted years in advance, executed with deadly focus and almost buried beneath distraction. It's a reminder that evil doesn't always come loud. Sometimes it arrives quietly, wrapped in paper, dropped at your door. For all the judges who read their mail with caution, for all the civil rights attorneys who stand firm despite the threats, for all the families who lost someone not because of where they were, but because of what they stood for, this case matters. It mattered in 1989. It matters now. And it will matter for as long as justice has enemies. The legacy of Walter Leroy Moody Jr. is not in his name. It is in the silence he created and the courage that answered back. That's the story of the Judge Vance bombing, a quiet man, a loud death, and a nation forced to confront the terrifying truth that even the guardians of the law can become its victims. Let us never forget.